On the morning of September 12, 1942, at Charter Towers Airfield in Queensland, Australia, heat shimmers rise in visible waves from the tarmac surface. A Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber moves steadily toward a temporary hangar built from corrugated tin and sheer determination. Within that hangar, a 43-year-old man works with grease-covered hands and a fierce intensity in his gaze, about to alter the course of the Pacific War. His name is Paul Irvin Gunn, though everyone knows him as Pappy. Within 6 hours, the aircraft he has been modifying will launch an attack against a Japanese airfield located at Buna, New Guinea. Should his modifications prove successful, American bombers will at last possess the firepower necessary to devastate Japanese shipping and ground installations. Should they prove unsuccessful, men will lose their lives, and this innovative veteran pilot will be remembered as the misguided fool who squandered valuable time and scarce resources on a wild, impractical notion. Yet Pappy Gunn is not dwelling on the possibility of failure. His mind is focused on his wife and 4 children, trapped 1,700 miles to the north in a Japanese internment camp at Santo Tomas in Manila. He is thinking about the convoy of Japanese transport vessels he witnessed slip through American forces just last week, simply because no aircraft could fly low enough, maintain slow enough speed, and deliver lethal enough force to halt them. He is considering how a medium bomber, originally designed to release ordnance from 12,000 feet, might be transformed into something the Japanese forces have never encountered before, a low-level strafing beast capable of shredding ships, neutralizing anti-aircraft fire, and converting enemy airfields into death zones. This is not a tale of cutting-edge technology providing the solution to a military challenge. Rather, this is the story of a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who, equipped with nothing more than salvaged fighter planes, basic hand tools, and a consuming need to end a war that held his family captive, converted America's medium bombers into the most terrifying gunships throughout the Pacific theater. This is the story of how improvisation triumphed over formal engineering, how desperate necessity became the mother of an invention that would establish the standard for close air support for decades to come, and how one man's burning rage transformed aluminum and weaponry into an instrument that would help crush the Japanese Empire. If you are finding value in this in-depth exploration of the story, please hit that subscribe button and share with us in the comments section where in the world you are watching from today. The North American B-25 Mitchell bomber was never intended to serve as a gunship. When it emerged from the production line at the North American Aviation Plant located in Inglewood, California, during 1941, it had been designed as a medium bomber, a dependable workhorse aircraft intended to deliver substantial bomb loads, both economically and with accuracy, from moderate altitudes ranging between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Twin Wright R. 2000, 600 engines powered the craft. 64 feet measured from nose to tail. 95 feet of wingspan. A loaded weight totaling 33,000 pounds. A maximum speed reaching 230 miles per hour. An operational range of 1,300 miles. The Mitchell represented a solid, dependable aircraft, named in honor of Brigadier General William Billy Mitchell, that charismatic prophet of air power, who demonstrated in 1921 that aircraft could indeed sink battleships. The bomber carried a crew complement of 6, including the pilot, the co-pilot, the bombardier navigator, the radio operator, and 2 gunners. Its defensive armament consisted of a tail gun, a dorsal turret, and a ventral gun tray that required almost a full minute to extend, during which time a Zero fighter could execute 3 complete attack passes. The waist guns presented nearly as much danger to the Mitchell's own vertical tail surfaces and engine nacelles as they posed to enemy fighters. The aircraft was completely conventional, thoroughly tested, and completely inadequate for the type of warfare being waged in the Southwest Pacific during 1942. Throughout the jungles and islands of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, altitude represented a luxury that American bomber crews could seldom afford. The jungle environment significantly diminished the effectiveness of medium-level bombing operations. Flying at 10,000 feet, a bombardier might identify a ship, an airfield, or a supply depot. However, Actually striking it through the thick jungle canopy while facing anti-aircraft fire and being harassed by Zeros was an entirely different challenge. Bombs released from altitude became scattered. Many vanished into the jungle terrain without ever detonating. Others fell harmlessly into the water. The few that managed to find their targets frequently inflicted minimal damage because they lacked the necessary precision to strike at vulnerable points. Meanwhile, Japanese supply convoys continued running their nightly operations, sustaining cut-off garrisons, reinforcing positions under threat, and transporting troops and equipment throughout their extensive Pacific empire. American submarines were exacting a price, yet submarines could not maintain presence everywhere. The United States Army Air Forces required a method to pound these convoys from the air, to rob the Japanese of the freedom of movement that geography appeared to provide them. They required aircraft capable of flying at low altitude, maintaining position over targets, suppressing defensive fire, and executing devastating strikes against both ships and shore installations. The challenge was that no such aircraft existed within the American inventory during mid-1942. Fighter aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-39 Airacobra possessed the speed and agility for low-level attacks, yet they lacked the range, the striking power, and the ability to survive sustained operations against heavily defended targets. Heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, had been designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not for low-level ship destruction. Light bombers like the WWII Havoc demonstrated potential, but they remained in critically short supply. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was becoming available in growing numbers, but it had been engineered for an entirely different mission profile. What the 5th Air Force required was an aircraft that married the range and payload capacity of a medium bomber with the forward-firing firepower of a fighter. They needed something capable of approaching targets at wave-top altitude, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with continuous streams of heavy machine gun fire, and then either strafing the target into oblivion or skip-bombing it with 500-pound bombs released at such low altitude. They would bounce across the water surface like skipping stones before crashing into ship hulls below the PERS waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it within weeks, not months, and certainly not years. Because every week of postponement translated to additional Japanese supply runs, more fortified positions, and more dead American and Australian soldiers on jungle battlefields where air support represented the difference between survival and complete annihilation. Enter Major General George C. Kenney, who touched down in Australia during August 1942 to assume command of Allied air forces throughout the Southwest Pacific Theatre. Kenney was 53 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and a man who possessed zero tolerance for orthodox thinking when that orthodoxy was getting his men slaughtered. He wasted no time in touring his dispersed bases, searching for solutions to the tactical challenges that were draining his bomber force of life. At Charter Towers Airfield, located south of Townsville in Queensland, he discovered something noteworthy: an oil and grease-covered former Navy pilot in his early 40s, laboring inside a shelter on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting it from a light bomber into something altogether different. Paul Irvin Gunn, called Pappy by every person who knew him because at 43 he was considered ancient by Air Force standards, was unlike any officer Kenney had previously encountered. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy during 1918, served 21 years as both an aviation mechanic and later as a naval aviation pilot, and retired in December 1939, holding the rank of Chief Petty Officer. He was an expert in the art of low-level flying, a naturally gifted aircraft mechanic, and a man who comprehended airplanes the way a blacksmith comprehends iron, because he could reshape them with his own two hands. Following his departure from the Navy, Gunn had relocated his family to the Philippines, where he contributed to the founding of Philippine Airlines, piloting 5 privately owned Beechcraft aircraft on cargo and passenger routes across the islands. When the Japanese launched their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was stationed in Manila. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately requisitioned Philippine Airlines aircraft and personnel. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Forces holding the rank of captain, placed in command of a hastily assembled air transport squadron, and given orders to evacuate military personnel from territory held by Japanese forces. During the following 6 weeks, Gunn piloted mission after mission into hostile airspace flying, unarmored Beechcraft planes, evacuating pilots, delivering supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, and executing feats of low-level flying that established his reputation as either the most courageous or the most insane pilot throughout the Philippines. He survived being shot down on one occasion, crashing into a coconut plantation, and being rescued by the plantation owner, someone he had previously flown as a passenger during peacetime. Finally, in late January 1942, Gunn piloted one of the final aircraft departing from the Philippines to Australia, transporting key personnel to safety. However, he was forced to leave something behind. His wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and Paul Jr., were trapped in Manila when the city capitulated. On January 20th, 1942, the Japanese forces rounded up American and Allied civilians and confined them at the University of Santo Tomas. Pappy Gunn's family would remain as prisoners there for 3 years, surviving on starvation rations, subjected to brutal discipline, slowly deteriorating while he fought from Australia, powerless to reach them, powerless to protect them, capable only of killing as many Japanese as possible with the desperate hope that ending the war more rapidly might preserve their lives. This was the man that General Kenny discovered working on an A-20 inside a tin shelter at Charter Towers during August 1942. This was the man who, when questioned about his activities, described how he was installing 450 caliber machine guns into the bombardier's nose section, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal panels and transforming the light bomber into a low-level strafer, capable of suppressing anti-aircraft fire and tearing enemy aircraft and installations into fragments. Kenny inquired where Gunn had obtained the machine guns. Gunn clarified that he was scavenging them from wrecked fighters scattered throughout Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras damaged beyond any possibility of repair, but possessing functional weapons. The 5th Air Force supply of 50 caliber machine guns remained severely restricted throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. There were never sufficient quantities. Therefore, Gunn did what any competent mechanic does. He improvised. He located wrecks. He salvaged guns. He fabricated mounting systems. He tested, made adjustments, tested once more. He made it function, because making it function represented the only available option. General Kenny found himself impressed. This veteran sailor comprehended something that headquarters staff in their comfortable offices would never grasp, that wars are not won through following established procedures, but through solving problems, and that the most effective solutions frequently originate from people who know their tools with sufficient intimacy to adapt them to new applications. Kenny immediately assigned Gunn to his personal staff with the title of Special Projects Officer, and provided him with a straightforward mandate: convert additional aircraft, make them more lethal, accomplish it quickly. Gunn commenced work with a fury that amazed everyone surrounding him. He was not merely an engineer addressing a technical challenge. He was a father attempting to save his family by reducing the duration of a war. Every aircraft he modified, every sortie that aircraft executed, every Japanese ship destroyed or airfield obliterated brought the war nearer to Manila, nearer to Santo Tomas, nearer to his wife and children. Fury represents a powerful motivator. Desperation proves an even more powerful engineer. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted multiple A-20s into strafers. The modifications appeared crude, yet functioned effectively. 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the nose section. Solid metal panels replacing the bombardier's transparent station. Additional ammunition storage capacity. Bomb racks modified to accommodate parachute fragmentation bombs. Small bombs slowed by parachutes, allowing the attacking aircraft to escape the blast radius, even at ultra-low altitude. The parafrag bombs would drift gently downward over enemy airfields and installations, detonating above parked aircraft and fuel dumps, raining down red-hot fragments and white phosphorus that ignited everything the fragments contacted. The converted A-20s underwent combat testing on September 12, 1,942 during a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea. The results surpassed every expectation. Flying at wave-top height and tree-top level, the strafers thundered in before defenders could mount a response, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with streams of 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds, then releasing their parafrag bombs directly above the target. Japanese fighters caught on the ground erupted in explosions, fuel dumps detonated, buildings disintegrated. The lightly constructed Japanese aircraft, built for agility and range rather than armor, tore apart under the half-inch bullets, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The strafers climbed and banked away, leaving behind a scene of destruction that resembled the wrath of an angry god. General Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to execute the same modifications to the B-25 Mitchell. This presented a more substantial challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, relatively compact, relatively straightforward to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, larger, more complex, with different aerodynamic properties and structural considerations. Adding weight to the nose of an aircraft alters its center of gravity, which influences its stability and handling characteristics. Installing guns generates recoil forces that must be absorbed by the airframe. Modifying a bomber engineered for high-altitude level flight to execute low-level strafing runs meant accepting risks that no engineer at North American Aviation would have sanctioned. However, Pappy Gunn did not work for North American Aviation. He worked for General Kenny, and General Kenny held no concern for what the manual stated was possible. He concerned himself with what required accomplishment. Gunn received assistance from Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative stationed at Charter Towers. Fox transmitted drawings of Gunn's proposed modifications back to the factory in Long Beach, California, but there existed too few B-25s in the theater to spare any for modification experiments yet. The first B-25s were required for conventional bombing missions. Gunn would be forced to wait for additional aircraft to arrive before he could commence the conversions that would establish the character of the remainder of the Pacific Air War. The waiting proved agonizing. Every day signified more supply runs, more reinforcements, more American soldiers perishing on jungle battlefields, more time his family endured in that internment camp. Gunn piloted combat missions himself, testing his A-20 conversions, refining the tactics, and proving the concept. He flew more missions than nearly any other man in the theater, accumulating combat hours and enemy kills, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts, 9 separate wounds. 9 times he bled during combat and continued flying. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells were arriving in Australia in greater quantities. General Kenny authorized Gunn to commence the conversion program. Working alongside a small team of mechanics, Gunn established a B-25 conversion center at Townsville. The modifications proved extensive. Remove the transparent bombardier's nose section. Replace it with solid metal panels. Install 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 positioned in the nose, 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional weapons, 2 more forward-firing guns in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, elevating the total forward-firing armament to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Add the dorsal turret's 2 guns, which could be synchronized to fire forward with the fixed guns, and some B-25s could bring 14 50-caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 50-caliber machine guns. Each gun fires 850 rounds per minute. Each round a half-inch diameter armor-piercing projectile, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. 14 guns equaled 11,900 rounds per minute, approaching 200 rounds per second, generating a cone of destruction so concentrated that anything caught within it simply disintegrated. The conversions required time, weeks, not overnight. Not a single desperate night of improvisation, but rather a sustained program of modification and testing. Each aircraft required careful modification to preserve structural integrity. The guns required alignment, testing, and adjustment. Ammunition feed systems required installation and debugging. Pilots required training in new tactics for an aircraft that now handled differently, carried more weight in the nose, and demanded different flying techniques to compensate for the weight of all those guns and all that ammunition. However, the results, when they materialized, proved devastating. The first squadron of Strafer B-25s stood ready for combat in early 1943. They would demonstrate their value in the most dramatic fashion conceivable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most lopsided victories throughout the history of naval aviation, a battle that would prove beyond any question that Pappy Gunn's jury-rigged gunships had transformed the Pacific War permanently. During the first days of March 1943, intelligence reports arrive at General Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea. A Japanese convoy is gathering at Rabaul, 8 transport ships transporting nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers. Their destination is Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces are experiencing pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represents a massive reinforcement operation, sufficient troops to reverse the tide of the ground campaign, and sufficient supplies to maintain Japanese resistance for many months. General Kenny understands what he must accomplish. The convoy must be destroyed, not merely damaged, not simply delayed, but destroyed. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies, because if those 7,000 troops arrive at Lae, American and Australian soldiers will compensate for it with blood on jungle battlefields, where the enemy already possesses every advantage that terrain can offer. Kenny possesses the aircraft to accomplish it. He has B-17 flying fortresses for high-altitude bombing operations. He has B-25 Mitchells, both conventional bombers and Pappy Gunn's Strafer conversions. He has A-20 Havocs, similarly modified. He has P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and strafing operations. And he has a new tactic that has been tested in smaller engagements, but never against a target this large, this well-defended, this important: skip bombing. The concept appears simple in theory, terrifying in execution. A bomber approaches its target at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. At point-blank range, perhaps a quarter-mile from the target, the bomber releases its bombs with a slight upward trajectory. The bombs skip across the water surface like flat stones thrown by children at a pond. Except these stones weigh 500 pounds and contain high explosives. They skip once, twice, then crash into the ship's hull at or below the waterline, precisely where naval architects understand a ship is most vulnerable. The explosion opens the hull to the sea. The ship floods. The ship sinks. However, skip bombing demands pilots to fly directly toward heavily armed warships through walls of anti-aircraft fire, low enough that a single error means striking the water and disintegrating, slow enough that enemy gunners have sufficient time to aim, close enough that if the bomb detonates prematurely, the attacking aircraft becomes caught in its own blast. It demands nerves of steel and perfect timing. It demands aircraft capable of suppressing the anti-aircraft fire long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. It demands Pappy Gunn's Strafer B-25s. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea commences on March 2nd, 1943. The Japanese convoy departs Rabaul, steaming southwest through the Solomon Sea toward the Huon Gulf and Lae. Australian reconnaissance aircraft locate the convoy and shadow it, reporting position and course. General Kenny mobilizes his air groups. Bombers and fighters take off from bases throughout New Guinea and northern Australia. The weather proves terrible: heavy clouds, rain squalls, poor visibility, but the weather functions in the Allies' favor, permitting aircraft to approach unseen until the final moment. The first attacks follow conventional patterns. B-17 flying fortresses bomb from altitude on March 2nd and 3rd, achieving few direct hits, but forcing the convoy to maneuver constantly, reducing its progress. Then the weather clears on the morning of March 3rd, and Kenny unleashes the strafers. The modified B-25s and A-20s come in low, so low that their propellers are churning spray from the wave tops. They approach in formation, a wall of aircraft bearing down on the convoy at 200 miles per hour. The Japanese ships observe them coming. Anti-aircraft guns commence fire. 20mm and 25mm cannons throw up walls of explosive shells. Heavier 40mm guns pump rounds in arcing trajectories. The sky fills with tracer fire, with black puffs of exploding shells, with the smoke and fury of desperate defense. And then the Strafers open fire. 14 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft. Multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously. Thousands of rounds per second hammering into Japanese ships. The effect proves apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft gun crews are scythed down where they stand. Gun shields are perforated like paper. Bridge windows shatter. Superstructures are shredded. The armor-piercing rounds punch through light armor, ricochet off steel bulkheads, tear through wooden structures, ignite fires, detonate ammunition. The Japanese gunners who survive the initial onslaught find themselves suppressed, unable to aim, unable to fire, forced to seek cover as half-inch bullets tear apart everything surrounding them. And in that window of suppressed fire, the skip-bombing B-25s and conventional Mitchells release their loads. 500-pound bombs skip across the water. Some miss. War is never perfect, but many strike home. They crash into hulls below the waterline. They explode with the force of half a ton of high explosive concentrated against the weakest part of the ship's structure. Steel plates buckle, welds fail, the sea pours inward. The transport ships, heavily laden with troops and supplies, prove particularly vulnerable. They are not warships. They lack armored hulls or sophisticated damage control systems. When the bombs strike, when the hulls open to the Pacific, they begin sinking immediately. Troops below decks, trapped in compartments that are flooding, have nowhere to escape. The ships settle lower in the water, list to one side, then capsize or break apart and slide beneath the waves. The destroyers fare better. They are warships designed to absorb punishment, but even they cannot withstand the coordinated assault. One destroyer takes a bomb amidships and breaks in half. Another is so riddled with 50-caliber fire that it becomes unmanageable, drifting in circles as fires rage unchecked. A third destroyer, attempting to rescue survivors from a sinking transport, is caught by strafers and transformed into a funeral pyre. The battle continues for 3 days. Every time the Japanese attempt to rescue survivors, Allied aircraft appear. Every time a damaged ship attempts to limp away, it faces attack again. The strafer B-25s hunt like wolves, working in coordination with conventional bombers, with fighters, with reconnaissance aircraft spotting targets. They employ the new parachute fragmentation bombs, floating them down over the decks of destroyers, killing exposed personnel, starting fires, creating chaos. They strafe lifeboats and debris fields, not out of cruelty, but because those survivors are soldiers who, if rescued, will fight again on New Guinea's battlefields. By March 4th, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was concluded. The results prove staggering. All 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 3 others heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the sinking ships or in the water. Fewer than 1,000 reach land, and most of those are immediately captured or killed by Allied forces. The reinforcement effort is annihilated. The supplies that were intended to sustain the Japanese garrison at Lae for months rest at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses: 4 aircraft shot down, 13 aircrew killed or missing. It stands as one of the most one-sided victories in the history of warfare. And at the center of it, making it possible, are Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s, the strafers that suppressed defensive fire, that allowed the skip bombers to approach, that tore Japanese ships apart with concentrated machine gun fire. General Kenny immediately orders additional conversions. Word spreads throughout the theater. Other air forces desire the Strafers. The 13th Air Force sends B-25s to Brisbane for conversion. Depot engineers at Tontuta begin modifying aircraft. The 10th Air Force in India adopts the modifications. What began as one man's desperate improvisation in a tin hangar in Queensland becomes standard practice across the Pacific. However, the story does not conclude with tactical success, because North American aviation back in California has been observing. The factory representatives have been transmitting reports about Gunn's modifications. Engineers in Long Beach have been studying the results, and they have begun incorporating Gunn's innovations into new production models. In late 1943, North American introduced the B-25G model. The transparent nose has been eliminated, replaced by a solid metal nose housing a 75mm M4 cannon, a tank gun mounted in an aircraft, firing 3-pound high-explosive shells capable of engaging ships from 2 miles away and sinking smaller vessels with a single strike. 4 50-caliber machine guns supplement the cannon. The concept appears innovative. The execution proves problematic. The 75mm cannon produces tremendous recoil. Each time it fires, the entire aircraft shudders. Pilots struggle to maintain aircraft stability. The cannon requires manual loading, proves slow to reload, and rapidly exhausts its limited ammunition supply. After 7 weeks of combat, units equipped with the B-25G have depleted all their 75mm ammunition. The cannon-armed Mitchells represent an interesting experiment, but ultimately they prove less effective than Pappy Gunn's simpler solution, more machine guns. The B-25H model appears next, 1,000 aircraft built with even more machine guns. The 75mm cannon is replaced with a lighter 14-gun version, 8 in the nose, 4 inside blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret. Some H models also carry rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that can be ripple-fired in devastating salvos. However, the ultimate expression of Pappy Gunn's vision is the B-25J, introduced in 1944. North American builds over 4,000 J models. Many are delivered with transparent noses for conventional bombing, but the air depot system creates conversion kits, the strafer nose option. When a J model is converted to a strafer, it carries 1850 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in the fuselage packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 1 in each waist position, and 2 in the tail. 14 of those 18 guns fire directly forward. 1850 caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. 15,300 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, over 250 rounds per second. A B-25J strafer firing all forward guns simultaneously puts more lead into the air than an entire infantry company could fire with their rifles. The effect on targets is not destruction, it is disintegration. These heavily armed Mitchells continued to devastate Japanese targets throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa until the conclusion of the war. They strafe airfields, destroying parked aircraft. They attack bridges, severing supply lines. They hunt coastal barges and small vessels. They support ground troops with devastating close air support. They prove so effective that captured enemy documents warn Japanese forces not to engage when the strafers are overhead. Weapons are useless against them, and attacking will only enrage the monsters. The strafer crews develop their own tactics and their own reputation. They fly low enough to observe the expressions on enemy soldiers' faces. They approach from unexpected angles, over mountains, up valleys, along coastlines, using terrain to mask their approach until the final second. They work in coordination with each other, one aircraft suppressing fire, while another delivers the killing blow. They are feared, they are hated, they are merciless. And behind every one of those aircraft is Pappy Gunn's desperate fury, channeled into engineering, transformed into lethality. Major Gunn, promoted for his innovations and his combat record, is eventually sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the new B-25 variants at North American Aviation. It represents a recognition of his contributions, an acknowledgement that his field modifications have been so successful they need to be incorporated into production aircraft. However, Gunn does not desire recognition. He desires to be in the Pacific fighting, killing Japanese, shortening the war that holds his family hostage. He returns to the Pacific as soon as possible. He continues flying combat missions. He continues taking risks that make his commanders nervous. In late 1944, a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in the Philippines catches him on the ground. He is wounded, his 9th Purple Heart, badly enough that he is removed from active combat. The war continues without him. But by then, The Strafer program he pioneered is so thoroughly integrated into Pacific air operations that it no longer requires him. In February 1945, American forces liberated Manila. They fight house to house, building to building, against fanatical Japanese defenders who would rather perish than surrender. On February 3rd, American troops reach the University of Santo Tomas. They find over 3,000 internees, starving, sick, traumatized by 3 years of captivity. Among them are Clara Louise Gunn and her 4 children. Pappy Gunn is reunited with his family. They are alive, barely, malnourished, traumatized, forever marked by their ordeal, but alive. The war he fought to shorten, the modifications he made, the missions he flew, the Japanese he killed, all of it was for this moment. His family survives. The Philippines are liberated. The war grinds toward its conclusion. Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948, medically retired due to his accumulated wounds. He returns to the Philippines to rebuild Philippine Airlines, the airline he helped start before the war. The company expands, provides flights across the South Pacific, and becomes one of the region's major carriers. Gunn flies again, not in combat, but in commerce, carrying passengers and cargo instead of guns and fury. On October 11th, 1957, Colonel Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died when his chartered Beech 18 crashed in a storm over the Philippines. He is 57 years old. He survived 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of brutal combat in the Pacific War, 9 combat wounds, countless close calls, and the loss of nearly everything he cared about during the dark years when his family was imprisoned. A storm over the islands he loved finally claims him, but his legacy endures. The Strafer concept he pioneered does not die with him. During the Korean War, modified B-25s provided close air support using the same tactics Gunn developed. The principle of heavy forward-firing armament on a stable platform becomes doctrine. In the 1960 seconds, when the United States began developing gunships for Vietnam, the engineers looked back at Pappy Gunn's work. They study his modifications. They understand his insight, that sometimes the best weapon is not the newest or the most technologically advanced, but the one that puts the most firepower exactly where it needs to be. The AC-47 Spooky, the first modern gunship, uses sideways firing guns and a pylon turn, a different approach than Gunn's forward-firing strafers, but the same understanding that transport and bomber aircraft can be converted into devastating gunships. The AC-130 Spectre, still flying today with 105mm howitzers and sophisticated targeting systems, is a direct descendant of Gunn's vision. Take an aircraft designed for one purpose, modify it for another, and create a weapon so effective it changes how wars are fought. Every Air Force close air support doctrine written since the 1940 seconds acknowledges, implicitly or explicitly, that Pappy Gunn was right, that desperation can produce innovation, that field modifications can outpace factory design, that the side willing to improvise, to break rules, to transform its tools into weapons its enemies have never seen, holds an advantage that technology alone cannot provide. The irony is profound and multi-layered. A bomber designed to drop ordnance from altitude becomes a low-level strafer. A former Navy pilot, retired and running a civilian airline, becomes one of the most innovative weapons designers of the war. An aircraft modification program born from desperation and scavenged parts became the foundation for gunship doctrine used for 80 years. A man fighting to save his family helps destroy an empire. And perhaps the deepest irony, the B-25 Mitchell, which Pappy Gunn modified so dramatically, was never supposed to be a close air support aircraft. It was supposed to deliver bombs from medium altitude. It was supposed to be safe, orthodox, and conventional. But orthodoxy does not win wars. Innovation does. Desperation does. Fury channeled into engineering. The morning of September 12th, 1942, Pappy Gunn's modified, A-20 attacked Buna. The raid succeeded beyond all expectations. But Gunn was not celebrating. He was already planning the next modification, the next improvement, the next innovation. Because every day the war continued was another day his family spent in that camp. Every sortie his aircraft flew, every enemy position his modifications destroyed, brought the end closer. War is often portrayed as a story of grand strategy, of decisive battles, of great commanders moving armies like pieces on a chessboard. But wars are also won in tin hangars in the Australian heat, by middle-aged former sailors with grease under their fingernails and fury in their hearts. By men who comprehend that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is simply being willing to examine an aircraft, a perfectly functional, conventional, orthodox aircraft, and pose the question, what if we added more guns? Pappy Gunn asked that question. He answered it with a wrench and a welding torch, and the Japanese Empire paid the price in blood and steel at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 Mitchell flew in every theatre of the Second World War. It participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. It bombed targets across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It served with distinction in dozens of air forces around the world. Nearly 10,000 were built. It proved reliable. It proved versatile. It was loved by its crews. But in the Southwest Pacific, the Mitchell was something more. It was a gunship. It was a ship killer. It was a terror weapon that forced the Japanese to abandon daylight supply runs, to scatter their convoys, to accept that American air power could reach them anywhere, any time, and turn their ships into funeral pyres. And all of it, the tactics, the modifications, the victories, traces back to one man who refused to accept that his family's imprisonment was inevitable, who refused to accept that the war would last as long as orthodox thinking suggested, who refused to accept that aircraft had to be used the way their designers intended. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn did not invent the gunship overnight in a moment of desperate improvisation. He developed it over months of trial and error, testing and refinement, combat experience, and engineering insight. But he accomplished it faster than any official program could have. He accomplished it with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. He accomplished it because he had to, because every delay meant his family suffered, because fury is a powerful engineer when channeled through skill and determination. The Strafer B-25s were not perfect. They were nose-heavy. They handled differently than conventional Mitchells. The recoil from firing all those guns simultaneously was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably. Ammunition consumption was enormous. A Strafer could expend its entire load in seconds of sustained fire. The aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire because they flew so low. Crews died. Aircraft were lost. War is never clean, never easy, never without cost. But the Strafers worked. They changed the Pacific War. They allowed American forces to interdict Japanese supply lines, to support ground troops with devastating precision, and to destroy enemy installations before defenders could respond. They saved lives, American, Australian, and Allied lives, by shortening battles, by preventing reinforcements from reaching embattled garrisons, by giving ground forces the air support they desperately needed. And every time a Strafer B-25 dove toward a Japanese ship or airfield, every time those 14 machine guns opened fire and the target disintegrated under concentrated fire, it was Pappy Gunn's fury made manifest. It was a father's desperation transformed into engineering. It was improvisation defeating orthodoxy. It was proof that sometimes the best solutions come not from careful planning but from having no other choice. The Pacific War ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Pappy Gunn's family was free. The Strafer B-25s had helped bring that moment closer. How much closer? Impossible to calculate. But every ship sunk, every airfield destroyed, every battle shortened contributed to the cumulative pressure that forced Japan to accept the unacceptable. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, industrial production, courage, sacrifice. But they are also won by individuals who see problems and solve them, who refuse to accept limitations, who transform ordinary tools into extraordinary weapons. Pappy Gunn was such an individual. His contribution to victory was not a single decisive battle. It was hundreds of modifications, thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of enemy casualties, inflicted by aircraft he transformed. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a good aircraft. Pappy Gunn made it a great one, not by sophisticated engineering or advanced technology, but by asking a simple question: what does this aircraft need to do the job that needs doing? The answer was more guns, more forward-firing heavy machine guns capable of suppressing enemy fire and destroying targets with overwhelming firepower. So he added more guns. He added them with wrenches and welding torches, with salvaged parts and improvised mounts, with ingenuity born of desperation and refined through combat experience. And the result changed warfare. 80 years later, the United States Air Force still operates gunships based on principles Pappy Gunn pioneered. The platforms are different, turboprop transports instead of piston-engine bombers. The weapons are more sophisticated: cannons, howitzers, precision-guided munitions. The targeting systems use radar, infrared sensors, and computers that would have seemed like magic to Gunn's generation. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. A transport or bomber aircraft, properly modified, can deliver sustained, devastating firepower against ground targets with a precision and intensity that other platforms cannot match. Every AC-130 gunship pilot owes a debt to Pappy Gunn. Every close air support controller calling in fire from circling gunships is using tactics refined in the skies over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. Every innovation in aerial gunnery stands on foundations. Gunn laid in a tin hangar in Queensland, working with hand tools and fury. This is not the story of advanced technology defeating primitive enemy equipment. The Japanese were not unsophisticated. Their aircraft were excellent. Their ships were well armed. Their pilots were skilled and courageous. They understood warfare as well as anyone, but they did not have Pappy Gunn. They did not have a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who understood aircraft intimately enough to transform them, who was desperate enough to try unconventional solutions, who was furious enough to work 18-hour days modifying bombers, because every hour of delay was an hour his family spent in captivity. The Japanese fought bravely. They fought skillfully. They fought with everything they had. But they could not adapt as fast as Gunn could innovate. They could not counter tactics they had never seen before. And when those strafer B-25s came in at wave-top height, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water toward their hulls, all the courage and skill in the world could not save them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.